excited to moderate this discussion today. It's one of my favorite topics, and I think something that's certainly fascinated me since I was a child. I'd like to just get right into it with these wonderful speakers we have today, and to start out with a very big question of what is the nature of consciousness? That is, what is it? What is it? And also, what is the function of consciousness? What does it do? And if you like, we could start with Professor Woollacott.
Thank you, Scott. Yes, I think I would like to say that I see the ultimate nature of consciousness as vast and limitless. It's a vibrating, loving awareness that exists beyond time and space. And it's simultaneously the essence of the universe and also the essence of our own awareness. And you asked, what is its function? And I think as this infinite consciousness is the essence and the foundation of the universe, I believe it is responsible for bringing this manifest universe into existence through its own infinite freedom and creativity. And this is part of its way of getting to know and experience all aspects of itself. And in fact, there's an ancient text from Kashmir from the 10th century by a sage named Utpaladeva that says that this act of creation is a play. And the term they use is krida in Sanskrit. And it means that manifestation is a playful, joyful, loving act of universal consciousness as a way of knowing itself. And in fact, the scientist Bernardo Kastrup, who is from the Netherlands, has said something similar. He says, life may be the way universal consciousness becomes cognitively aware of itself. And physicist Federico Fagin says that each act of self-knowing of the one consciousness creates what he calls a consciousness unit, a small self as a part of itself with the capacity to perceive and know itself and act with free will. And of course, that's all of us and the things of the universe. And of course, then people ask why we don't experience that consciousness fully. And I just want to say, I believe it's because in our own normal embodied existence, various parts of our mind-brain complex act as filters, that is, partial barriers of this experience. For example, there is considerable research now that John Vervaeke may talk about as well, about the default mode network in the brain, including the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, which creates the narrative in our mind-brain complex of who we are and how we relate to the world. And I believe these stories fill much of our awareness during the day, filtering out those other experiences of vastness. And in fact, there are research studies by Judson Brewer and Roland Griffiths and others that show that when the default mode network's activity is reduced in meditation or with mind-altering substances like psilocybin, a more expanded awareness is experienced, as well as a sense of interconnectedness with others and with the universe. And this is often described as a mystical experience of oneness, joy, and absolute love, with our identity with the small self seeming to dissolve and only one vast self remaining. So in concluding, I would say, according to this view, the brain and its sense organs are not the source of our mental experience, but they act as a receiver or a filter, and they typically reduce the extent of information we experientially receive from that vast consciousness, which I believe is our essence.
Beautiful. A very spiritual answer from a scientist. So. Swamiji, do you want to talk a little bit about your perspective and your tradition's perspective?
Thank you, Scott. And if I were to put it in one word, I would say that, what you just said just now. I'll put it more or less the same thing from a different perspective and different language. So we can start with the function of consciousness, and that would be illumination, revelation, experience itself. So what does consciousness do? It reveals itself and it reveals everything else. So there's a Sanskrit word for that, prakasha, which is also the Sanskrit word for light. So light is often a metaphor. We don't mean that consciousness is a material light, but it's somewhat like light. For example, if you switch on a light, it reveals everything in a dark room, and it reveals its own existence also. Exactly like that, consciousness reveals everything in our life. If you just think about it, our life is basically the illumination of consciousness illumining things. So whether in different modes, whether we are seeing or hearing or smelling or tasting or touching, or thinking or remembering or desiring, or the sense of self, all of that, these are experiences. And all experiences are nothing but this illumination, consciousness illumining objects. And these objects may be external objects like a computer or a flower or a person out there, or it could be internal objects. Internal, I mean internal to the mind, first person experiences of thoughts, feelings, memories. All of these are revealed by consciousness. So consciousness plus an object is experience. And our life is nothing but a series of experiences. It would be helpful to distinguish consciousness from, let's say, knowledge. So there are all these very smart machines nowadays. For example, the very computer I'm sitting facing, in one sense, it is gathering information. There's a camera and there are microphones, and in many ways, it is sucking in information from its environment and transmitting it. Much like what consciousness does, except for one thing. There is no, as far as we know, no internal first-person experience of what it is like to be a laptop. So all these machines, which actually gather information and in some sense generate knowledge, quote unquote, there is no internal feel what it's like to be from inside, let's say. That internal feel, that first-person experience, what is sometimes nowadays they are called qualia. All of these are various attempts at trying to describe what consciousness does. What is it in itself? It's just this it's fundamental. So it's not derivative from our tradition, which is the Advaita Vedanta tradition. It's a fundamental reality. It's not derived from brain or anything else. And here there are two views. There is the Sankhya view, which is also a very ancient Indian philosophy, where consciousness and objects are two fundamental realities. There is nature and there is consciousness, and they interact and they give rise to us, basically. So the body is a set of objects, the mind is objective also, and consciousness, we are consciousness illumining the mind body. And the external universe is also objective. So that way, Sankhya would get along merrily with science, at least, I mean, to a very great extent. Now, Advaita Vedanta takes up from there and says, what is the relationship between consciousness and the objects it illumines? And Advaita Vedanta would say something very much like what Marjorie just said from the Kashmiri Shaiva tradition, that the entire objective universe is not out there, but it's rather in consciousness. And it's basically consciousness appearing to itself as its own objects. So I realize that's a sort of metaphysically vast answer. Let's just put it this way. Consciousness is fundamental ontologically because it's the ultimate reality. It's fundamental epistemologically because that makes all knowledge and experience possible. It's also fundamental axiologically because this is what ultimately seeks and provides meaning. So these are the three terms: Sat, pure being; Chit, pure awareness; and Ananda, pure bliss, which sort of are the Advaita Vedanta answers to the three fundamental questions of all philosophy. What's real? How do we know anything? And what's the point of it all? And all of them would be consciousness.
That's beautiful. Professor Vervaeke, can you talk a little bit about this question? And you're still anchored too in your current academic stream and your peers. So how do you defend some of these more expansive ideas of consciousness too? And what does science say today about consciousness?
So I'll first try and talk about the questions.
Yeah.
I recently gave a talk on the Consciousness and Conscience Conference where I talked about the three questions. The first two that have been mentioned: what's the nature? That's how does something like consciousness exist in this universe? The function is, what does consciousness do? And then the third is, what's the relationship between those two questions? Can they be answered independently or interdependently? The first is a third question. I think it's really ultimately not possible to talk about function without talking about nature. or to talk about nature without talking about function. I can give a larger argument, but I think that's an intuitively graspable claim. So we need a way of answering these two questions together. And what I find problematic is usually that they're not answered in an integrated fashion. One question is given priority, and then the other one is derived from it. I instead would argue that there's a way of answering the two of these together. And the way to do that is to first see from a cognitive science perspective why the two questions are challenging, why they're problematic, why consciousness is the holy grail of cognitive science. So the function question, it's like, well, what does consciousness do? Why is that problematic? Because you do so much unconsciously. There are sounds coming out of my face hole, and they're becoming ideas in your mind, and you have no awareness or even knowledge of how that is happening. You can be driving down the highway without any awareness at all, automatic pilot, and then you realize, oh, I haven't been paying attention at all. And so this is a question of, given that you are capable of very complex, very sophisticated, intelligent behavior without consciousness or awareness, what's it for? What's it do? The next question, the nature question, is consciousness seems to be radically unlike the rest of things. Swami said, you know, what's it like? It seems to be one of the fundamental features of consciousness, and to be about something. I'm conscious of the room, I'm conscious of you. These features don't seem to be, at least apparently, properties of physical things. This doesn't seem to be about anything else, and it's given me no evidence that it has a first-person perspective of what it's like to be this rock. And so it's, how does something like consciousness exist in a world that does not seem to apparently have all of the features of consciousness? That's the nature question. The function question, I think there's a growing consensus as to what the function of consciousness is. And the way to do that is to ask, what are those kinds of actions that seem to require conscious experience? And the consensus answer seems to be when you're confronting very novel, very complex, or very ill-defined situations. And what goes on with that then is a broader view. And I want to pick up on something Swami said. The computers are taking in all kinds of information. Yeah, they are. But we are having a lot of difficulty actually making them intelligent because they lack a property that we possess, which is the computers don't care about the information they're processing, and you do. And that is really central to being an intelligent being. There is so much information you can be aware of. You have to actually ignore most of the information that's in the environment, because if you tried to pay attention to it all, you'd be overwhelmed. Think of all the information in your memory. If you tried to access all of it all at once, you'd be overwhelmed. You have to select from it. Think about all the sequences of behaviors you could put together. Vast, but you select. So you're constantly zeroing in on relevant information. And then when that ability to zero in on relevant information, which is what most of the theories of the function of consciousness are converging on, when it's brought to bear on novel, complex, ill-defined situation, that relevance becomes salience. It becomes the way things stand out to you. The way I'm foregrounded, this is backgrounded, the room you're in is probably even more backgrounded, etc. And so you're doing all of this relevance realization, salience landscaping, sizing up of the world. And this is very central. Now, I think we have to be very careful about the hard problem. One of the criticisms I have of the hard problem is how to explain things like qualia, the first-person perspective. And one of the problems is that we have to distinguish between the qualia that are necessary to consciousness and those that are just often found in consciousness. So in meditative states, people can often realize what's called the pure consciousness event. They are not aware of the world. They're not aware. They're not even self-aware. They're just purely conscious. This is well documented. And what's interesting about that is a lot of the favorite qualia philosophers, the greenness of green, the blueness of blue, the sense of self disappear. But the person hasn't blacked out. They haven't become unconscious. So what remain are the adverbial qualia, the here-ness, the now-ness, the unity. Those are often described in superlatives. Eternity is a complete here, complete now, complete unity. And what that shows is the adverbial qualia are necessary, and I think I can also make an argument sufficient for consciousness. The adjectival qualia are not. Now, what are those adverbial qualia? Well, the here-ness and the now-ness and the togetherness are your basic way of sizing up and salience landscaping your world. What it's like to be here now in this state of mind. That's my perspectival knowing. That's what consciousness is doing. So its function is to do salience landscaping, and its nature as adverbial qualia is the kind of thing that emerge when a being is capable of doing salience landscaping. This helps to explain the deep connections between consciousness, attention, working memory, and fluid intelligence. In fact, you can't pull apart areas of the brain that are active when you're conscious from when you're paying attention, right? There's debates around this, but more and more people are saying that they're tightly integrated. They're overlapping functionalities. I agree with Marjorie in that I think consciousness is a filter, but I think that the brain is a filter, but I think consciousness is the filtering rather than consciousness is being filtered by our brain. I think consciousness is precisely how we're filtering the environment. If you could not be conscious of all of the information within and without you right now. Consciousness is filtering most of that out so that you zero in on what you should be remembering, how you should be formulating the problem that's at hand, and you are a problem, understanding me, how you're sizing up the situation, how you're assuming and shifting between different roles or identities. Perhaps you're a student, perhaps you want to challenge, etc. And so I think that you can give an integrated answer as to what consciousness does that also helps tell you what it fundamentally is, and vice versa.
I wanted to follow up next by talking a little bit about how we even probe consciousness. I think a lot of either frustration and beauty is that probing consciousness is something that is subjective for the most part. So is it entirely subjective? Are there only subjective ways to probe consciousness? What's the role of direct experience in understanding consciousness? And also, how valid is subjective experience as we're studying consciousness and coming up with these quite detailed answers as to what it is? And maybe start with Swamiji, with the tradition that's been doing this for some thousands of years.
I love that distinction between the adverbial qualia and what was the other thing, the adjectival
qualia, yes.
Adjectival qualia. That's immediately recalled to me the basics of the Yoga Sutras, which says that when you purge consciousness of all objective experience, which would be the adjectival qualia, I guess.
Yes.
And then you are left with the nature of consciousness itself, which would be the adverbial qualia, which is, it fits in very well, that kind of thing. And then they give actual practices which will enable us to do that. Yeah, so that's really very interesting. One important distinction I would like to make, which will help us in this inquiry about whether it's subjective or not, is what is subjective and what is objective. From an Advaita or Sankhya perspective, whatever appears to consciousness is an object to consciousness, just by definition. So whatever you are aware of, if you can say this, if you can designate it with this, then it's an object. And that to which those are objects, that's the real subject. Now, why is this distinction important? It is quite different from the way we talk about consciousness in general in the philosophy of mind or in neuroscience or consciousness studies, even now. So right now, when you ask the question, is it entirely subjective? The way we are talking about consciousness, it's already sort of implicit there that the things in the world out there, which is sort of publicly shared with us, so the room and the body and our behavior and our language, this would be objects. And the rest of it, internal, first-person experience, is all subject. But if you make if you take the definition of whatever appears to consciousness is an object, then a good deal of what is our internal experience, thoughts, emotions, perceptions, all the adjectival qualia, they would also be objects. They would no longer be the subject. So that's the track which Advaita, Sankhya, Patanjali Yoga, all of these traditions they take in investigating what is consciousness. Just take this definition that whatever appears is an object. The philosopher Arindam Chakravarti, who's in Hawaii, he puts it very well. He says, an object is anything that objects to consciousness. So imagine consciousness like a limitless field spreading out there, and it encounters forms and sounds and smells and thoughts and memories, and all of them are objects. So this field encounters it and it lights it up, and then you have an experience. So those are events. Right. So the way to investigate consciousness from these ancient traditions, they're all inside out ways. So, and the reason it works so well is, notice, consciousness is something that's continuously available to all of us. Notice the difference between the inquiry in consciousness studies and the inquiry, say, in particle physics or neuroscience. Black hole or strings, superstrings is not something that is at all evident to us. It requires super specialized investigation, theoretical and experimental, to find out anything at all about those things. Or even neuroscience. It's right here in the brains, but neuronal activity, but it takes sophisticated science and instrumentation to find out something about that. But consciousness, on the other hand, has been something that's always available to all of us all the time. In fact, some would argue that's all that is available to us anyway. So subjective inquiry into consciousness has always been possible, which is why you have had theories of consciousness in the most ancient Indian, Chinese, Greek traditions. The most ancient thinkers have always had something interesting to say about consciousness. They might not have anything at all to say about the brain or neurons, for example. So an inside-out investigation, and there are methodologies for this investigation in yoga. That we can talk more about that later. Meditative inquiries and philosophical inquiries, both inside out. And I'll talk something more about that when the time comes.